In the heart of the dense woods, a soft, pitiful whimper echoed through the trees. The sound barely carried above the wind, but it was enough to stir something primal in the silence of the forest. The puppy, alone and trembling, huddled against a tree. Its fur was matted and dirty, eyes wide with fear, its tiny body quaking from hunger and exhaustion. Despite its fragile state, the puppy's instinct remained: survive, find help, trust no one but itself. Around it, the trees stood like silent sentinels, their leaves whispering stories of forgotten souls. The weather had taken a turn for the worse. Dark clouds gathered overhead, casting an ominous shadow over the clearing. A cold drizzle began to fall, turning the earth beneath the puppy's paws into a slick, unforgiving mud. Yet the puppy didn't move. Its eyes, tired and desperate, scanned the area, searching for any sign of life. A flash of movement caught its attention. A branch cracked, followed by the rustle of leaves. Its ears perked up, and the puppy's heart skipped a beat. Was it a predator? Was it help? No, it was neither. Just another fleeting moment in this forsaken place. The puppy shivered, not knowing what to do next, lost in the vast expanse of the forest. With no one to care for it, the puppy could only wish for one thing: a way out. The puppy's body was worn, its ribs visible beneath the matted fur. The pain of hunger had become an aching companion, but it was the loneliness that gnawed at its spirit. No one had come for it, not since that last fleeting moment of hope when the door slammed shut behind its owner. The world had changed in an instant. No warning, no goodbye. The only thing left was this forest, this endless stretch of trees. And yet it couldn't shake the feeling that something more awaited it. Deep within the puppy's core was the stubborn desire to find something better, something that wasn't just survival, but hope. The forest seemed to have no end, and yet the puppy kept moving. It had no destination, no plan, but it walked with purpose, its paws sinking deeper into the mud with every step. The puppy's journey seemed endless, its legs growing weaker with every step. The rain showed no mercy, and the forest swallowed any sign of light. It was as though the world itself had conspired to erase the tiny creature from existence. And it paused for a moment, its tiny chest heaving as it tried to catch its breath. That's when it heard it. A sound, soft, distant, but unmistakable. A voice, faint but clear, crying out from somewhere in the woods. The puppy's ears perked up. Could it be? Was there someone else out here? It took a step forward, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air, its heart racing with a mix of hope and fear. The puppy's body tensed, its instincts urging it to investigate. Despite the fear that bubbled inside, there was a flicker of something else: determination. It had been abandoned, left to fend for itself, but this cry, this voice calling out, pulled it toward something bigger than itself. Its paws moved forward, each step tentative but purposeful. The path ahead was unclear, but the puppy followed the sound, its tiny heart pounding in its chest. The crying grew louder with every step, urging the puppy onward, deeper into the unknown. The cry grew louder, now unmistakable. It was human, a child, alone in the woods. The puppy's steps quickened, its breath coming in short gasps. This was no longer about survival. This was about something greater, something the puppy didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. With each step, the forest seemed to part just slightly, revealing a hidden truth. The puppy's ears flicked back as it neared the source of the sound. Whatever waited ahead, it could no longer turn back. The puppy's memories of home were vivid: warmth, love, laughter. It once belonged to a family, its days filled with joy and comfort. But now, it was a shadow of that life, abandoned and alone in the forest. The familiar faces were gone, replaced by silence. Hunger and fear became its only companions. The woods were cold, dark and endless. The puppy, lost and confused, wandered aimlessly, yearning for the warmth it once knew. But the forest offered no answers, only more pain. One day, the door shut. The world changed, and the puppy was left behind. Days turned into weeks, but its owners never returned. The food stopped, and the water dried up. The puppy waited by the door, its eyes fixed on the window, hoping for their return. But they never came. The puppy's world shrank to nothing, and it ventured into the unknown, searching for something it couldn't define. The forest was alien to the puppy. The trees were massive, their shadows dark. The air smelled unfamiliar, the ground was cold and wet. The puppy moved slowly, unsure of its surroundings. Every step was heavier than the last. The once familiar world had faded into a blur of trees and mud. Nothing seemed to offer comfort. Only more emptiness. Despite the loneliness, the puppy's instincts led it forward. There was something, a sound, a scent, that beckoned. It wasn't sure what it was, but it had to follow. With each step, the woods seemed less oppressive, as though a hint of something familiar waited just ahead. The puppy pushed on, determined to find out what lay beyond the shadows. Then it heard it, soft at first, but unmistakable. A baby's cry. The puppy's heart raced, its body tense with both hope and fear. The cry grew louder, urging it to move faster. It wasn't alone. The puppy wasn't sure what it would find, but it could feel that this was the reason it had kept going. For the first time in a long while, it believed it had a purpose. The puppy's paws dragged through the mud, its small body trembling from exhaustion. It had been wandering for hours, the world around it growing darker, colder. Each rustle in the bushes made it flinch, the echoes of its former life, a distant memory now. The baby's cries had stopped, leaving only the haunting sound of the wind in the trees. The forest was alive with movement, but none of it was for the puppy. It felt abandoned, truly alone for the first time, as the shadows stretched long over the forest floor. Its instinct screamed at it to keep moving, but the weight of despair pressed down harder with every step. It wanted to give up, to collapse into the mud, and let the world move on without it. But something kept it going. It wasn't over yet. Not for the baby. Not for the puppy. Not for either of them. The forest seemed endless. Every step the puppy took was a battle, its paws slipping in the thick, slippery mud. The cries of the baby were still hauntingly fresh in its memory, yet the puppy couldn't find its way back. It had been days since it last saw any sign of life, and hunger gnawed at its stomach. It stopped for a moment, lowering its head, the weight of the world pressing down on its fragile body. There had been no food, no shelter, and the rain kept coming, relentless and cold. The forest had swallowed the last vestiges of comfort the puppy had known. The faint memories of a home, a soft bed, a familiar voice, felt like a lifetime ago. It was hard to imagine how things had gone so wrong. The puppy tried to push the thoughts away, but they returned, threatening to crush its spirit. The puppy's ears perked up as a sudden rustling sound pierced the quiet. Its heart raced, but the fear wasn't from the unknown, it was from the memories of what had come before. A figure stepped from behind the trees, moving slowly, almost as if it were hunting. The puppy's body stiffened, its instincts screaming at it to run, to escape. But the figure wasn't a predator. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and hollow. His eyes locked with the puppy's, and for a brief moment, neither moved. The man's expression was unreadable, but the puppy felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He wasn't a threat, but he wasn't an answer either. The man raised a hand as if to comfort the puppy, but it wasn't the hand of a rescuer. It was the hand of someone who had seen too much pain. The man took a step forward, his movements slow, almost cautious. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rasping from disuse. The puppy flinched, unsure whether the question was meant for it or something else, someone else lost in the shadows of the forest. The puppy didn't answer. It couldn't. Words wouldn't bring back the warmth of home, nor would they make the pain go away. The man seemed to understand. He knelt slowly, his movements careful, as if worried the puppy might run. "I know how you feel," he murmured, his voice heavy with something the puppy couldn't quite place. "I've been where you are." The puppy tilted its head, its heart pounding. Could this man know what it was like to be abandoned, to be lost, To be forgotten? But the man didn't say more. He just looked at the puppy, his eyes full of grief. And just like that, the puppy knew it was still alone. The moment stretched on, suspended in the air, and then the man slowly withdrew his hand. He seemed to understand the puppy's hesitation. "It's okay," he whispered, barely audible. "I'm not here to hurt you." But the puppy didn't believe him. The past had shown it nothing but cruelty. It had been abandoned by the one it trusted the most. There was no kindness left in this world. The puppy turned and began to walk away, its steps hesitant but determined. The man didn't stop it. He watched the puppy move deeper into the forest, the distance between them growing with each step. His face was unreadable, a mixture of regret and resignation. The puppy didn't look back. The forest was a cage, and it had no choice but to keep moving. The puppy's ears perked as footsteps broke the silence of the woods. The sound was deliberate, slow, and purposeful. The officer's heart rate quickened. Was it help? Or another danger lurking in the shadows? His grip tightened around the puppy, the weight of the moment settling heavily on him. The forest, once alive with mystery, now felt suffocating, as if it held its breath with him. The puppy shifted in his arms, sensing the tension. As the steps grew louder, the officer steeled himself for whatever would come next. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he might find, but he couldn't back down now. Whatever it was, the puppy's life, and the baby's, depended on him taking action. The sound grew clearer, and then, through the trees, a figure emerged. A man in uniform. Unwittingly. The officer's breath caught in his throat. The man in uniform stopped, his eyes meeting the officer's. For a brief moment, neither moved. The puppy, still trembling in the officer's arms, looked up at the new figure, uncertain but hopeful. "Are you lost too?" the officer asked, his voice firm but with a hint of exhaustion. The stranger shook his head, his gaze flicking from the puppy to the officer. "Not lost, just trying to make sure no one else is," he replied, his voice carrying a weight the officer couldn't ignore. The officer's eyes narrowed. There was something in the stranger's tone, something that didn't sit right. He didn't ask more questions, but the words hung in the air between them. Why was this man in the woods? And why was he so familiar? The stranger took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the officer. "I didn't expect to find you out here," he said quietly, almost as though speaking to himself. The officer stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his protective instinct flaring. The ranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the puppy, his gaze softening slightly. I thought I was the only one who knew what it was like to leave them," the stranger murmured. The officer's confusion deepened. The words carried an unspoken weight, a secret buried beneath the surface. "What are you talking about?" the officer asked sharply. But the man remained silent, his eyes flicking toward the shadows in the woods, as if haunted by something just beyond reach. The officer's patience was wearing thin, but he knew better than to push the stranger too hard. He had seen too many people crack under pressure, revealing truths that were better left buried. But something was different here. "You don't have to be out here alone," the officer said, his voice softer now. "There are people who can help. If you're here for the puppy or the baby, they need safety." The stranger flinched at the mention of the baby, his expression hardening. "I can't. Not anymore," he said quietly, the words barely audible. The officer frowned, sensing the depth of regret in his voice. There was more to this than a simple mistake. And the officer, for all his training, couldn't ignore the human element. The pain and guilt etched into this man's face. The stranger took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he looked away from the officer. "I didn't mean to leave them," he said, almost to himself. "I thought I was protecting them from a life like mine." The officer's heart sank as the man's words hit home. The puppy had been abandoned, but not without reason. There was a story behind every choice, no matter how painful. The officer set the puppy down carefully, his hand still resting on its back. "What happened to you?" he asked softly. The stranger finally met his eyes, his voice breaking. I was supposed to be their protector, but I failed. The officer didn't respond right away. There was nothing more to say. Not yet. The man had his own demons to confront, just as the puppy had its own past to recover from. The air was thick with silence as the officer stood, staring at the stranger. He had expected answers, but all he had were more questions. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. I thought I was protecting them. But who was this man really, and why had he left the puppy and the child? The officer's instincts told him there was more to this story. Why did you leave them? The officer asked again, his voice firm yet gentle, unwilling to let this moment slip away without the truth. The stranger's gaze dropped, his hands clasping tightly together, as if he could physically stop the past from unfolding. I never wanted it to end like this, the man whispered. But it's too late now. The officer took a step closer, his eyes scanning the man. He could see the pain, the struggle, the guilt. There was something here, something that had gone wrong. Who were you protecting them from? The officer asked, his voice soft but demanding. The stranger swallowed hard, his body trembling. Myself, he muttered. The officer froze, his heart catching in his chest. What did that mean? He had heard of people running from their pasts, but this felt different. This was something deeper. The man's past was his own cage, and the puppy and the child were caught inside it. The officer waited, giving him space to speak. I was dangerous, the man continued, and I couldn't stop what I was doing, so I thought I could save them by leaving them behind. The officer's breath caught in his throat as the stranger's words hung in the air. He had abandoned them because of his own darkness, his own fear of what he might do. But the officer knew that this man wasn't evil. He was broken. You don't have to do this alone anymore, the officer said softly, his tone firm but compassionate. You can make things right. The stranger looked up, his eyes filled with both hope and doubt. I don't know how, he whispered. The officer stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. My God. One step at a time, the officer said. It's not too late. And in that moment, the officer saw something in the stranger's eyes, something that had been missing for so long. The beginning of redemption. As the officer led the stranger away from the woods, the weight of the past seemed to lighten, step by step. The baby, now safe in the officer's arms, slept soundly, unaware of the struggles that had brought them here. The puppy, walking beside the officer, looked up at the stranger with quiet understanding. It knew what the man had done, but it also knew that everyone deserved a second chance. As they walked back through the forest, the officer felt the bond between them all grow stronger. You're not alone anymore, the officer repeated, more to himself than anyone else. The stranger nodded silently, his eyes focused on the path ahead, the first real hope in years flickering in his heart. The night had passed, and dawn broke over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the clearing ahead. The officer stood, watching as the first light of day bathed the forest in warmth. Puppy, now content and at peace, sat by the officer's side. The stranger stood a little apart, but his posture was no longer burdened. The baby slept peacefully in the officer's arms, safe from harm. We'll get through this, the officer whispered to himself, more confident now than he had been when he first entered the woods. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time, it felt full of possibility. The officer's heart was pounding as the stranger's shadow loomed behind him. The puppy, now alert and silent, was nestled in the officer's arms, sensing the tension in the air. The quiet woods felt heavier than ever, and the officer knew this was the moment that would change everything. You don't have to go through this alone, the officer said, his voice steady yet firm. The stranger's face twisted in pain as he slowly stepped closer, his eyes haunted by a past he couldn't outrun. I can't undo what I've done, the stranger whispered. But I need to try. The officer tightened his grip on the puppy. This wasn't just about the puppy or the baby anymore. It was about redemption, forgiveness, and what it meant to move forward. They couldn't undo the past, but they could still change the future. The officer's gaze softened as he looked at the stranger. "No one is beyond redemption," he said firmly, though his own heart was uncertain. "You still have a chance to make things right." The stranger looked at the officer, his eyes flickering with emotion, grief, anger, and a deep, raw longing. "But what if I'm too broken?" the stranger asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer's eyes hardened with resolve. "No one is too broken, not if they're willing to fight for it." The words hung in the air like a promise. The stranger swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Then let's fight together," he said. And in that moment, the officer knew, with a certainty that was almost terrifying, that this was the point of no return. There was no turning back now. The officer placed a hand on the stranger's shoulder, giving him a moment of comfort. "We start fresh," the officer said quietly. "And we do it right." The stranger nodded, a single tear escaping his eye. The weight of the years, the guilt, the choices, seemed to lift, just slightly. "But what about the puppy?" the stranger asked, his voice uncertain. The officer looked down at the small creature in his arms, its big eyes looking up at him with trust. "The puppy knows what it's like to be abandoned," the officer replied. "But it also knows what it's like to be loved, and it'll teach us both." The puppy, sensing the shift, wiggled its tail slightly, offering the first glimmer of peace since they'd entered the forest. This was no longer just about survival. It was about healing, for them all. As the officer and the stranger turned to leave the forest, a faint, distant cry broke the silence. A baby's cry, clear and loud, piercing through the trees. The officer's heart skipped a beat, his protective instincts taking over. He rushed toward the sound, the puppy now alert and awake in his arms. The stranger followed closely, his pace quickening as the urgency of the situation hit him. "Stay close," the officer commanded, his voice sharp. "We don't know what's ahead, but we have to make sure the baby is safe." The forest, once ominous, now felt like a race against time, each step carrying them closer to the child, closer to their redemption. The officer's thoughts focused only on one thing, the baby. Everything else, the past, the pain, it could wait. Right now, they needed to save the child. The officer finally reached the edge of the clearing, where the sound of the baby's cries were coming from. He knelt down, carefully setting the puppy on the ground beside him. The baby, small and fragile, was lying in the dirt, its cries frantic. The officer quickly scooped the child into his arms, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. The stranger stood behind him, a silent witness to the baby's pain. "It's going to be okay," the officer whispered to the baby, holding it close. The puppy moved closer, nudging the officer's leg with a soft whimper. The stranger took a step forward, unsure of what to do but knowing this was his chance, to make it right, to help in whatever way he could. The baby was safe. Wrapped in a soft blanket, now resting in a warm crib, the child finally slept soundly. The officer couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, but that peace was tempered by the weight of everything they had been through. The stranger, now standing at the door, watched silently. His posture was more relaxed, a far cry from the man who had first appeared in the forest. "She's safe now," the officer said, his voice low but filled with relief. "You kept your promise." The stranger nodded, his eyes misting over. "I never thought I'd be here. I thought I was lost," he whispered. The officer looked at him, sensing a shift in the man. "You weren't lost. You were just waiting for the chance to change." And in that moment, the officer knew that the stranger, though broken, was beginning to heal. They all were. The next morning, the officer stood in front of a courtroom. The stranger, now formally charged, sat across from him. The officer didn't know how the court would rule, but what mattered now was the truth. He'd seen the man's remorse, his desire for redemption. The judge, after hearing the case, looked to the officer. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice neutral. The officer paused, his thoughts briefly drifting to the woods, to the cry of the baby, to the bond he had witnessed between the puppy and the stranger. "People make mistakes," he began, "but they also have the capacity to change. He deserves that chance." The stranger's eyes met his, gratitude and uncertainty shining in them. The officer had given him a chance, and now, he had to believe the stranger would make it count. The weeks passed, and the baby grew stronger. Laughter filled the house more and more, and the puppy, once trembling and fearful, now bounded around with joy. The stranger, working hard to prove his change, found a job at a local shelter, where he began helping others in need. The officer watched him, seeing the man he had never expected to find in the forest, a man willing to rebuild. It was slow, but progress was progress. And that's all they had now, the chance to move forward. The officer smiled as the puppy sat beside him, its head resting on his knee. "It's amazing what can happen when we start again," he said quietly. The puppy nudged his hand, a soft whimper of agreement. In this new chapter, they all had a part to play. The officer had always been a man of duty, of rules, but now he realized that sometimes life required more than just following orders. It required heart. It required forgiveness, not just of others, but of oneself. As he sat on the porch one evening, the puppy by his side, he watched the stranger walk toward the house, smiling as he approached. "I never thought it would end like this," the stranger said quietly, sitting next to the officer. The officer smiled, looking out over the yard. "It's not about how it ends, it's about how you move forward," he said. They sat there in silence, the warm breeze flowing through the trees, the sound of laughter in the background. It wasn't perfect. It was a work in progress. But it was real. The officer watched the puppy, now lying peacefully by the fireplace, and the baby, who had fallen asleep in the warmth of the home. It had been a long road, one full of pain and uncertainty, but they had made it through. They had found each other, and that was enough. As he looked out the window, the stars twinkling in the clear night sky, he whispered, "We made it." The puppy stirred slightly, as if understanding, and let out a soft, contented sigh. For the officer, the journey was no longer about what had been lost, but what had been found. Hope. Redemption. A family, bound together by love and second chances.